everyone, I'm once again diving into some recent literature, this time from the OECD with their paper entitled A Framework to Decarbonize the Economy. The link to the full paper can be found in the description of the video, and I encourage you to check it out if you want to take a deeper dive. Now, until this point, I've largely been focused on policy tools, but of course policy naturally tends to concern itself with policy issues. A policy issue is just a problem that needs solving by the government. Now, the determination of something as a policy issue is sometimes a controversial process, but it's certainly a political process and outside the scope of public policy and outside the scope of this channel. But once something is determined to be a policy issue, that's when we can look at it from the lens of public policy. So for this video, I won't actually be exploring the scientific literature around climate change because, strictly speaking, that's not the policy issue they're looking at. The policy issue they're looking at is countries lagging behind their commitments to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And so they are providing strategies for how countries can increase their decarbonization efforts while still promoting economic growth and social inclusion. So why economic growth and social inclusion? Well, like with any paper, it's important to look at who we're getting this information from. The OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, is an intergovernmental organization made up of largely rich countries. So the USA, Canada, most of Europe, Australia, Japan, among others. And their self-proclaimed goals are to foster prosperity, equality, opportunity, and well-being. And they largely do this through sharing best practices and through setting international standards. And so what are some of the biases that we can think of for this organization in this paper? Well, the first is that they are going to be focused on promoting economic growth. And this could come at the expense of other goals, such as promoting happiness, which is becoming more popular in some countries. Secondly, they're not going to want to go too far. Because the organization is focused on promoting economic growth, they're not going to want to hurt the economy, even if it can lead to increased decarbonization efforts excessively. Now, getting into the paper itself, they recommend 3 broad policy tools. The first is emissions pricing, the second is standards and regulations, and the third is what they call complementary policies. So, starting with emissions pricing. Any emissions price really works on the same fundamental principle. If it costs more to pollute, there will be less pollution. And really, that does make sense. From a consumer perspective, it makes low-emitting goods more attractive because high-emitting goods become more expensive. And for businesses, there is now incentive to reduce their emissions because it's affecting their bottom line. And so, there are 3 recommendations in the report for how to implement a emissions price. The first is a GHG tax, also called a carbon tax. The second is an emissions trading scheme, often also called a cap and trade system, and a tax on polluting goods. A GHG tax is a tax applied per unit of GHG emission, often in the form of a CO2 equivalent. So for each liter or gallon of gasoline, you will be charged a fee based on how much GHG will be emitted when that gas is burned. Now, the advantage of a GHG tax is it's directly correlated with how much pollution will come from every good, but there are some administrative costs in determining exactly what that fee should be for every good. The second system is an emissions trading scheme. In an emissions trading scheme, the government sets a cap on how much pollution they will allow, often by industry. They then sell permits up until that maximum. Companies can then buy and sell emissions based on how much they actually need to stay under their individual limit. This, however, is more costly than a GHG system because the government needs to set up the framework around the auction and the trading of the permits and has to monitor each individual company's emissions to make sure they are under their allotted amount. Finally, there's the tax on polluting goods. So this is where the government applies a tax to specific goods, say a gas tax. Now, the closer this tax on polluting goods is to a true GHG tax will determine its effectiveness. If it's far away and the tax is applied to goods that maybe are not the most emitting, it will have less of an effect on actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's what they recommend for emissions pricing. Now, the GHG tax is a little bit different than the emissions trading scheme because one uses the price axis and the other uses the quantity axis of a supply and demand graph to achieve really the same results. And then the tax on polluting goods has the advantage of having the lowest administrative cost because it's a flat tax that is easy to apply and easy for businesses to comply with. Now, the disadvantage they state for all emissions pricing schemes is that they are not very politically palatable. And so that means it's not necessarily a good solution to increasing government's decarbonization efforts. And so now moving on to the regulations and standards section. Regulations also increase prices, but they do so in a way that is a bit more hidden. So that makes the authors believe that it is something that will be more palatable to the public and easier to implement. The first of those regulations is performance standards. Think of, for instance, a minimum fuel economy for cars. This will reduce the amount of greenhouse gases for every kilometer or mile driven. Another way to do this would be something like a fee-based system, whereby purchasers of high-emitting vehicles pay into a fund that is then used to subsidize the purchase of low-emitting vehicles. This, however, would be less effective than something like an emissions price because it does not provide any incentive to reduce emissions beyond whatever the standard is. The second regulation is related to that first one, and it is a tradable performance standard. This is sort of a combination of the performance standard and the emissions trading scheme. Like a performance standard, there would be a standard set, but for companies that go beyond the standard, they would get a permit that they can then trade to other companies who are not yet meeting the standard. So this is the advantage over traditional performance standards in that it allows an incentive to exist for companies that have already met whatever the standard is. The third regulation is subsidies to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So this is subsidies for direct carbon capture technology. This can take the form of either direct payments or tax subsidies. And so for me, it would really more fall under an expenditures category. But again, that just shows how subjective the policy tools framework is. So these subsidies can be a potentially big solution, but there remains cost about the feasibility and really just how much this would cost from the government to see tangible results. The fourth regulation is information to consumers. By providing better information, consumers can make better informed choices. The effectiveness of this regulation would depend on how strong the desire is for consumers to reduce their personal greenhouse gas emissions and what the available alternatives are that are lower or no emissions products that can satisfy consumers' needs. Then finally, the fifth regulation is technology standards and input requirements. These can be used to force industries to adopt a specific technology or process that is lower emitting than what some in the industry are doing. The advantages, this can be applied very quickly and directly to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. However, whenever you're forcing a particular technology, that limits competition and incentives for innovations within the industry. The third set of policies, complementary policies, are designed to reduce the amount of either emissions pricing or standards and regulations that is needed to achieve any given target. The first of these complementary policies is research and development. This can either be done directly through government-sponsored research enterprises or through government-funded universities, or it can be done through incentives to motivate the private sector to increase their research and development capacities. Two technologies that benefited a lot from government research support are solar panels and wind turbines. The second complementary policy is investing in infrastructure that supports a low-emitting economy. The two sectors they look at for this are the energy sector and the transportation sector. For the energy sector, they discuss increasing the amount of renewable energy in the production of electricity and increasing the load to handle more activities being electrified. This can ensure that the price of electricity doesn't rise exponentially. For the transportation sector, one of the things they discuss is providing the infrastructure for recharging stations to ensure that there is a sufficient supply to meet an ever-growing demand. What this does is it reduces the cost for drivers of electric vehicles because they have to spend less time seeking out a charging station. The third complementary policy is they can use revenue generated from these policies to offset some of the distributional effects. And so what they mean is you can use some of the revenue from the emissions pricing scheme to, say, send a lump sum transfer to individuals or to provide some specific transfers to maybe individuals in most need. They can also use some of these revenues to reduce existing taxes, which would have the advantage of reducing some of the negative effects that would come from whatever those taxes are. Another option would be to invest in infrastructure that would support perhaps the most vulnerable communities in society, thus increasing their interest in supporting these policies. And revenue could also be used to pay for some of the other climate policies that were recommended in this report, for instance, research and development. And so those are the main policy areas that I wanted to look at from this paper, but they do have some other sections looking at limiting subsidies for fossil fuels, supporting workers in transitions, and providing a comprehensive analysis at where countries are at right now relative to their commitments. So again, if you want to check out any of that or check out any of this in more detail, I encourage you to check the link in the description for the full paper. But that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.